Hey there, welcome to the Lore to Death podcast, a deep dive into the lore of your favorite games, movies, shows, and more. My name is Brett, and today I feel like reminiscing over one of my favorite games, and that would be Skyrim. More specifically, I want to talk about something that I don't think a lot of people know about, or a lot of people know enough about. But if you're anything like me, when you're playing the Elder Scrolls games or any Bethesda game in general, and you have to read every single book, every single entry, then you might also be well-versed in this topic. And that topic is the history of the Falmer, also known as the Snow Elves, and the Dwemer, or the Deep Elves, and the bloody history between the two. There's a reason I haven't touched the Elder Scrolls IP up until this point, and that's because, to me, it's a very daunting prospect. There's so much lore that Bethesda puts into their games, and it's almost overwhelming. And granted, at this point, I've talked about Fallout numerous times, and that might seem like it's in the same vein, but the Elder Scrolls feels entirely different. With Fallout, at least, it's rooted in our world, whereas the Elder Scrolls is very much not. It's very much a fantasy world, and therefore it feels like it's a bit more of a challenge to tackle. I don't know how to describe it, but that's how I feel. That's how I've always felt, but I'm excited to be delving into this world. So with that being said, I'm going to do my best with the lore, as always. And just one more thing before I start, and it should probably be obvious, but there are going to be no spoilers for the games in this episode. As far as I'm concerned, all the information that I'm getting on the Falmer and the Dwemer, respectively, comes from various books across the series. Most of it comes from Skyrim, and it has nothing to do with story whatsoever. That might feel like a bit of a moot point to make, but I always do appreciate a good spoiler warning, even if it's just to make sure that I'm safe to listen to certain episodes. So without further rambling, because I could ramble on forever, let's start by talking about the Falmer. I mentioned this at the top of the episode, but the Falmer are also known as the Snow Elves, or Ice Elves, or Frost Elves, or really anything to do with winter and then elves. You'll notice that all elves in the Elder Scrolls have Mer at the end of their names, and that's because Mer is a collective term that describes all elves in Tamriel. The prefix to Mer is a descriptor of a specific group of elves. So in this case, Fal would mean snow or frost, and Mer would mean elf. And the Falmer, or Snow Elves, were a group of proud elves with a strong, wealthy, and prosperous culture that would rival the Altmer, or the High Elves. And while we don't have a ton of information about the history of the Falmer, we do have evidence of their prosperity with the Chantry of Ariel that the Falmer created, which was a vast series of temples located across the Forgotten Vale, a deep glacial valley. The Chantry was massive and lavish, as you would expect of a shrine to Ariel, the chief in the Elven pantheon, and was the epicenter of Falmer religion. There were other temples that the Falmer created to other deities, but none were nearly as grand as this one. And that does bring up an interesting little side note that it does seem like the Falmer did worship other deities. It wasn't just Ariel. But again, the main one was Ariel. Within this chantry were many way shrines which were built and infused with Falmer magic to act as teleportation devices. From Knight Paladin Gelibor, we learn that the Falmer were capable of great magic. It's said that the Snow Prince was able to make ice and snow churn around himself as if it came from within him, and that extended to the other Falmer, who also had an affinity for ice magic. Many Falmer would make the pilgrimage to the Chantry of Ariel, and many would not survive that pilgrimage, as it was not only soul-crushing, but physically demanding, as the elements of the Forgotten Vale were extremely harsh. Many would die on these pilgrimages, but that stood as a testament to their loyalty and faith to Ariel. However, there were plenty who would start the path and turn around shortly thereafter, realizing the danger that it posed. And this would cause them, and others around them, great shame. But we didn't come here just to talk about one temple, we came to talk about the history of the Falmer. I just thought it was worthwhile to mention the temple, as it was a testament to who they were as a race, which is gonna make a sad story of their history. And speaking of their history, just like many elves, we don't know when exactly or where they first settled, just that they were kind of there in Tamriel one day. The first records of the Falmer came from the Nords, who came from Atmora, who are aptly named the Atmorans. They wrote about the Falmer when they settled in Skyrim, and the two races were said to have lived alongside one another in peace for a period of time, which was beneficial to both races. Becoming more prosperous as a result of this connection, the Atmorans built the city of Sarthal, which served as their first capital under their leader and founder, Ysgramor. If you played through Skyrim and did the Companion's Quest, this name should sound pretty familiar. The founding of Sarthal made the Falmer fearful, understandably, as the Nords began to settle in Skyrim and get closer and closer to their land, which, of course, the Nords claimed was theirs by birthright. This is a pretty common theme for the Nords to immigrate and then start taking claim to various lands under false pretenses. And so this weakened their relationship with the Falmer, who, eventually, began to fear that the Nords would declare a colonial war on them. So they did what they thought was best and decided to make a preemptive strike against Sarthal and raze the city to the ground in what would be known as the Night of Tears. The only Atmorans who were known to have escaped were Ysgramor and his two sons, as well as a famed enchanter. It seems like a bit much to raze a city to the ground over the fear of being driven out of your own lands when nothing had actually happened to that effect yet, no? There was some speculation that the Night of Tears was not only about territory, but about power. The Nords were said to have found an item, the Eye of Magnus, and were trying to keep it hidden from the Falmer. So, as soon as they caught wind of the object, they desired it for themselves, as they knew the magical properties that it contained. It's said by some that this was the sole reason for the attack, and that territory and fear of colonial war actually had nothing to do with it. But it's hard to say because those accounts are from the Nords. And furthermore, from historians who are probably writing from the Nords' perspective. We don't really have anything from the Falmer on the matter, so it's hard to say what their thoughts were about it. We can only really speculate from their actions. I personally think that colonial expansion of the Nords was a factor, and possibly the initial reason. But once they had unearthed the artifact, the Falmer had an inkling that if they were able to harness its power, then the Nords would drive them out for good. After all, the Eye of Magnus was basically a super battery of magic power, so whoever controlled it might as well have controlled the land, assuming they were able to tap into its power. But, again, it's hard to say who the bad guys are here. Anyways, Ysgramor escaped with his two sons, and they went back to Atmora to gather an army with which they could strike back at the Falmer for destroying their capital. And so legend has it that they gathered the 500 companions with the help of a famed enchanter, Ozadal, who was the other person who escaped from Sarthal, who enchanted their weapons to give them an extra edge in battle. With this, they went back to the remains of Sarthal, where they would find the Falmer and begin a long war where they were ordered to show no kindness and no mercy. The companions would hunt down any and all Falmer across Skyrim, killing them wherever they found them. The only time that they would ever take prisoners was to try to get information out of them as to where they could find more snow elves so that they could kill them as well. The companions would eventually found the city of Whiterun around an ancient statue of an eagle, which would become the city's Skyforge because of the importance that the Falmer prisoners gave it, stating that it was far older than even the elves. And that kind of sets the tone for how Nords ran things. They seem to find places of import to other races and then decimate their population and then promptly build cities around their relics. And I know I'm talking a lot of smack about the Nords, but sometimes it's kind of hard to find the good in the bad. The Falmer were eventually pushed to a point where they had to mount an all-or-nothing offensive against the Atmorans, which would end up with them losing their snow prince and the war altogether. Having lost so much of their population, coupled with the failure of their last offensive, the Falmer were forced to retreat with the small population that was still alive. They knew that they had elven kin in Blackreach, so they went deep underground to beg for some kindness from the Dwemer. The Dwemer were an advanced civilization of elves who were, in many respects, further ahead in terms of technology, engineering, mathematics, and magic, among other things, than other races were at the time. The Dwemer, as mentioned before, were also known as the Deep Elves, or were more commonly referred to as dwarves. Being associated with dwarves, you might assume that they're all short, stout, and 60% beard by volume. But that's not quite the case. Contrary to popular belief, the Dwemer were just as tall as the average man, typically had the lean, slim build of an elf, and they did, admittedly, tend to sport a lavish beard. Unlike most elves, and they did have a penchant for mining. The myth that they were as short as children seemingly came from giants, who referred to the Dwemer as their little friends. And, well, everyone's a little friend compared to a giant. So I think it's safe to say that this is just a little bit of a miscommunication. However, it's hard to say exactly what they looked like since most information about their race was seemingly lost to time, as we'll get into later. And just like the Falmer, we don't know when the dwarves came to Tamriel, nor do we know anything of their history before that point. Recorded Dwemer history starts in the Merithic era, just like the Falmer. By this time, the Dwemer had established themselves in the Velothi Mountains, which was situated between Morrowind and Skyrim. Sometime around First Era 221, while they were mining, they discovered a new mineral which they called Aetherium. This was a blue luminescent crystal that possessed magical qualities, but was unusable without the right tools. The Dwemer, being a people that were heavily invested in mining and engineering, were the only ones that were able to make use of it because of its finicky nature, from what I can tell. They were able to fashion it into artifacts which were inherently powerful because of the magic imbued into them with Aetherium. 4 major dwarven cities, and these are going to be really hard to pronounce, Arkanthams, Ralbathar, Mzulft, and Betharzel came together in an alliance to maintain control over Aetherium, and each city had its own part in that process. Arkantham served as the main command center and primary research facility, while Ralbathar, which was the primary source of Aetherium, was given the role of dealing with mining operations. Mzulft was used for storing materials and supplies, and we aren't quite sure of what role Betharzel was assigned. The Aetherium Forge was constructed deep beneath the city of Bethalft, where the Aetherium artifacts were constructed under precisely controlled conditions. Like I said, it was a very meticulous process to be able to mine, refine, and use Aetherium. So this place, the Aetherium Forge, was, as far as I know, the only place where they could actually make use of it. This was a very prosperous endeavor, and even the Nords couldn't get their greasy hands on the United Dwemer cities, but it couldn't last forever. Eventually, each city and its folks started to get greedy and wanted control over Aetherium for themselves. So they all tried to take control of the Forge, which led to a civil war known as the Aetherium Wars. Over time, this weakened the Dwemer city-states and basically crippled their empire from the inside out. Seeing this discourse as an opportunity to strike, the Nord High King Gelir of Skyrim advanced on the weakened Dwemer. His armies swept through the Dwemer like they were nothing and took over many of their cities in a matter of 3 years. It's said that about a century later, the Dwemer came back for their cities and managed to actually gain a foothold in Skyrim once again, but for some reason it was abandoned. I would assume that they were going back to take over the Aetherium Forge, but perhaps the cost of doing so was too great and it had to be abandoned. Perhaps they feared that the discourse that led to them being driven out in the first place was doomed to repeat itself. Alas, we will never know. What we do know is that the Dwemer retreated underground into Blackreach after their defeat by the hands of the Nords, and as far as we know, this is where they would stay, deep underground from the prying eyes of other races. It's down here in Blackreach that the Dwemer would encounter some Falmer who were looking for refuge after they, too, had been ransacked by the Nords up above. However, I realize that the way that I wrote that makes it seem like they came down at the same time, but no, the Dwemer were down in Blackreach far before the Falmer were. So the Falmer came to them. And you would think that since all elves were cut from the same cloth, or at least that cloth was bought at the same store, that they would probably like each other and see a kinship in each other, and would want to help each other. But you would be wrong. Elves have problems getting along with their own section of elves, hence the Dwemer having a civil war which led to their near extinction, let alone tolerating other elves. And don't get me started on their attitude towards non-elves. Elves are a very xenophobic people, and maybe it's because they've just been mistreated for their entire history, but I feel like they were also mistreated because of their xenophobia. You know, which came first, the chicken or the egg, the xenophobia or the wars? I don't know. It was probably the xenophobia. And thus, the Dwemer decided to take the Falmer in under their wing. But Brett, you just said that elves hate other elves. And yes, I did say that. And yes, the Dwemer took in the Falmer regardless because they were a different breed, one that could see past the petty differences of their kind and see that the Falmer were indeed brethren in need of help. The Dwemer were the paragons of kindness, the barons of charity, the icons of niceties. And that's why the Dwemer took them in and made sure that the food that was given to the Falmer was poisoned with a toxic fungi that wouldn't kill them, but maim them over time. Did I get you with that one? I sure hope so, but I feel like my sarcastic tone really showed through. The fungi that the Falmer were fed unknowingly in conjunction with the darkness of Blackreach eventually rendered them blind. Or at least I think they were fed it unknowingly. It's hard to say because the source, the Falmer, a study, only says that they were forced to eat the fungi. I don't see why they would knowingly eat something that they knew would cause them to go blind or have other side effects. If they knew, why wouldn't they have just left and tried to find somewhere else, potentially in Blackreach, to settle for a while? After all, Blackreach is huge, and I don't see why they couldn't find a place where the Dwemer weren't. And yes, there were others who did leave the initial group who went to the Dwemer to find shelter elsewhere, but most of them ended up dying or coming back to the Dwemer to be under their care. I just don't see a reason why they would be consciously forced to eat a toxic fungi, and I think it makes more sense that they were fed it in their diet unknowingly and became blind over time. Either way you look at it, whether or not they knowingly or unknowingly consumed the fungi, there is one thing that we do know. The Dwemer are just awful, terrible beings. The once majestic and powerful Falmer were rendered basically powerless, and they went from being a culturally rich group to being hunted, to being in servitude to the Dwemer, to being straight up slaves for the Dwemer. The fungi that they ate was a part of their regular meals, and they had no way out of this hell that they found themselves in. The fact that they were continually forced to eat the fungi to make sure that their offspring would be blind as well, which the Dwemer knew full and well that was a tactic, makes the Dwemer seem even worse in this scenario. Now, I'm not trying to excuse what the Falmer did up on the surface that caused the Nords to come down on them with their armies. They, just like the Dwemer, got too greedy and sought too much power. They made the mistake of razing the Nords' capital city, and that's terrible for anyone to do. Of course they were going to retaliate, especially for a mere artifact, no matter how powerful it was. Would the Nords have eventually attacked against them if they had not attacked first? Almost certainly, but mayhaps it would have gone differently if they were on the wrong side first. Who knows? Regardless, much like any other story involving slavery, the Falmer ended up rebelling against their masters. There was a group of Falmer who ended up overthrowing the Dwemer, and were able to retreat deeper into Blackreach, where the two factions would end up warring for decades. This part of the history isn't dated, much like most of this information about elves, unfortunately, so we don't know exactly how long they were fighting for. It seems like the elves didn't care much for chronicling their escapades, and no one up on the surface even knew that they were fighting, so we can't rely on the Nords chronicling this part of their history. And this is where things start to get a little weird, as things tend to in the Elder Scrolls universe. And this bit gets kind of confusing, since the account is seemingly written by someone who just assumed that everyone reading knew all of the people involved, so it's pretty shallow and there's a lot of missing information. I'm sure that's intentional, but it's a bit frustrating regardless. So there's a couple different sources that I'm going to be patching together here, and hopefully it makes a good amount of sense. I think I did a decent job of explaining this situation, so here we go. At some point, we had what was known as the Battle of Red Mountain. And we have a couple different accounts on the matter, like I just mentioned, but the most thorough was a transcript of a conversation with Lord Vivec, who was one of the 3 immortal god kings of Morrowind. He talks about how his people, the Chimer, or the beings who the modern Dunmer or Dark Elves descended from, worshipped the Daedra as gods, while the Dwemer mocked them and preferred to follow logic and reason instead of what he describes as foolish rituals. It was because of this that the Chimer and the Dwemer were at constant war with one another. That was until the Nords showed up back to their usual antics to invade Morrowind. Then, and only then, did the Chimer and Dwemer team up to cast out the invaders. After they had succeeded, the two leaders, General Nerevar of the Chimer and General Dumak of the Dwemer, had come to, and I quote, love and respect one another, and attempted to make peace between their peoples. This was a fragile peace, as described by Vivec, but a peace regardless. And this is just proof that everyone can bond through stopping a Nord invasion. And being a fragile piece, it didn't take much to break it. Lord of the Khmer House Dagoth-Ur, a friend to both General Nerevar and General Dumak, brought proof to the Khmer that the Dwemer had discovered the Heart of Lorkhan. They were allegedly planning to use the heart, which contained a divine spark, to build a new god as a weapon, and a further mockery to the Khmer faith. See, the Dwemer were always innovating and creating things, like we saw with the Aetherium Forge and creating powerful artifacts. And they were probably best known for their military creations. They created constructs that were basically giant metal automatons whose sole purpose was to wreak havoc on battlefields. They had many different kinds of automatons, from human-sized constructs on rolling spheres to smaller mechanical spiders and up to giant centurions who wielded a battle axe and war hammer simultaneously and had nigh impenetrable armored plates. These were all powered by soul gems and were exceedingly dangerous and made the Dwemer fearsome enemies because they had a disposable mechanical army alongside the army that was made up of their people. This is something that, as far as I know, no one else had anything close to. So the Nords even attacking the Dwemer in the first place is kind of insane and kind of shows the audacity of the Nords. They didn't care who they were fighting. They just wanted to fight and take over places. So this is all to say that when someone catches wind of the Dwemer creating a giant mechanical god, that this is something that's definitely not out of the question for the Dwemer, and it's something that you might want to look into rather than shrugging it off. And so the Khmer were urged to surprise the Dwemer with a war to catch them off guard and take them out for their mockery of the Khmer faith. However, General Nerevac was troubled and didn't want to shatter the trust that they had built with General Dumak. So Nerevar seeked out a Dwemer engineer by the name of Kagranak and asked him if the rumors were true and was met with great offense. Kagranak asked who Nerevar thought he was to meddle in the affairs of the Dwemer, and that was the end of the conversation. Like I mentioned before, elves don't really play well with other elves, and I also said this was a fragile alliance. So not all of the Dwemer loved all of the Khmer, and not all of the Khmer loved all of the Dwemer. It was basically just the two rulers who loved and respected each other. Everyone else probably hated the other, and themselves, for that matter, honestly. So one might have taken that short conversation to mean that Dagoth-Ur was correct, and that the Dwemer were using the Heart of Lorkhan to create a god. But Nerevar was still troubled, and, props to him, still didn't take this as a means to start a war. So he made a pilgrimage to the Temple of Azura, and had Azura confirm that what Dagoth-Ur said was indeed true. Having the confirmation of a god to say that the Dwemer were up to no good, Nerevar wanted to confront Dumak one last time in hopes that they could avoid a war. And third time's the charm, I guess. Dumak was bitterly disappointed in his friend that he would go through all of this effort just to prove that he was doing something wrong. And the only way that they could settle this dispute was through war. So again, props to Nerevar. He really tried not to go to war. And it seems like the Dwemer were the ones who were like, no, I'm insulted. We must start a war. So, man, Nerevar is so much better than anyone gives him credit for. He might be the least xenophobic elf in all of history. So this war that started was the Battle of Red Mountain that I mentioned before. It was named after the stronghold that the Dwemer held up in, Red Mountain, where they intended to hunker down and stay in. Unfortunately for them, the cunning plans of Nerevar drew them out into the plains where their armies were pinned. Meanwhile, Nerevar, Dagoth-Ur, and a small group of soldiers were able to take advantage of the Dwemer armies being elsewhere and made their way into the Heart Chamber. It was there that they met with Dumak and the Dwarf King, who were on their knees, collapsed by grievous wounds and draining magic. Nerevar and Dagoth-Ur were threatening to kill the two when suddenly the engineer Kagranak turned his tools upon the Heart of Lorkhan, and, in a flash, Nerevar said that he witnessed the 3 Dwemer in the chamber, along with all the other Dwemer elsewhere, to disappear without a trace. Poof! Gone. Nerevar told his people that the Dwemer had used the heart to turn their people immortal, and that the heart held wondrous powers. Dagoth-Ur, on the other hand, told others in secret that he believed that they had destroyed themselves rather than turning themselves immortal. But I'm not sure that anyone really knows what happened here and that they were all just trying to come up with an explanation for seeing the Dwemer suddenly blip out of existence. And that's the unfortunate end for the Dwemer. We don't really know what happened to them, just that they tried to create a god for themselves and ended up wiping themselves out from existence. I would have to imagine that they're just on another plane somewhere trying to find their way back home, but they could have all just died for all I know. And we will probably never see them again or hear about them again. Maybe we'll get some exposition, but honestly, this seems like a pretty finite story. All of the people who were there in the room say that they have no idea what happened, so unless the Dwemer come back and we get a personal account from Dumak, or the Dwarf King, or Kagranok, I don't think we're getting any more information on this matter. Which is really unfortunate, honestly. So, what does that mean for the Falmer, the slaves of the Dwemer? Well, that meant that they were finally free from servitude. Their masters had all vanished out of thin air, and really they could do whatever they wanted to. Except that they were still blind, and their offspring would likely still be blind. So they weren't exactly free from the shackles of the constraints that the Dwemer forced upon them, but they were able to spread throughout Blackreach at the very least and make it their home. They kind of devolved into goblin-like creatures who were feral from years of being mistreated. They were also at war with the Dwemer when they disappeared. So they had an unsatiated bloodlust which made their feral behavior even worse. They would begin to raid the surface, allegedly stealing babies from cribs, attacking travelers on the road, and becoming the thing of nightmares and monsters of bedtime stories. People started blaming any misfortune that happened to them, like crop failure or getting lost in the woods, on the Falmer. And yeah, they were really just a boogeyman at this point. Flash forward into the 4th era, people started seeing them more often, and they weren't just the things of myth. They were actually raiding the surface in brutal attacks. One scholar theorized that the Falmer could be using these attacks to gauge the threat levels of those on the surface so that they could one day launch an all-out attack and reclaim their lands and their long-lost glory. He also claims that no one, not even the Nords, could stop this, and that if the Falmer actually came up in full force, they would easily overrun the lands. To this end, they ended up taming beasts in Blackreach to do their bidding, like the Chorus, a large insect-like creature with a hard carapace and sharp piercing appendages. To this day, both Falmer and Chorus can be found on the surface in Dwemer Ruins and small caves. Granted, in small numbers. Most of them were still in Blackreach. Over time, there were a few Falmer who managed to evade the Dwemer and maintain their original form, not blinded, or malformed, or feral. One of these was Knight Paladin Galibor, who I mentioned before. He seems to think that their intelligence has increased over time, and while it's unlikely at this point that the Falmer of Blackreach will ever return to their original forms, he thinks that one day they might be able to establish some sort of communication with them in an attempt to make peace. Whether or not that's true, or that would do anything to help them, the Falmer will never, again, reach their former glory, but they might be able to have a life worth living. As for the Dwemer, they are nothing more than a bogeyman at this point. People know they exist from the ruins that are dotted around the lands, but their language is indecipherable, and since their technology was so far beyond what others were capable of understanding, no one really knew how to make use of any of that technology. There had been some advancements made, and some of their technology was able to be repurposed in a more modern society, but it was largely just broken down and used for scrap. In the years past, people had tried to tinker with the Heart of Lorkhan. One of those was a scholar from Winterhold who hired the Dragonborn to help them attempt to kickstart the heart with a warped soul gem. While they were working on keening the soul gem, they disappeared immediately, just like the Dwemer did, further strengthening that it was tampering with the heart that caused them to disappear. And that's honestly all I really have to say about the Falmer and Dwemer. Sure, there are some more subtle aspects of each culture that I probably could have gone over, but none of it really fit within the story that I wanted to tell. I think that overall this is a relatively complete and comprehensive story of the Falmer, the Dwemer, and what happened between them, and that's all I really wanted to tell. And so that brings us to the part of the episode where I ask the only question I reliably never get an answer to. What did you think? Do you think that if the Falmer didn't attack the Nords first, that maybe they wouldn't have ended up in the hands of the Dwemer in Blackreach? Or How about, do you think that the Falmer were knowingly forced to ingest the toxic fungi? Or do you think that, like I do, it was just kind of snuck into their diet? I think I've said all I can say in that respect already, but I'm genuinely curious to hear someone maybe more well-versed in the lore of Elder Scrolls and what they have to say. Because that's one of the few things in this story that I just really don't feel like I know. It's very vague, and again, probably intentionally so. But these are the things that I want answers to, because either way that you put it provides a lot more context to the actions of the Dwemer. And while they're terrible either way, it would personally kind of scratch that itch for me to know which it was. You can find us online at Lore to Death on your favorite social media apps, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have any questions or suggestions for topics, please send me a message wherever you can find me at loretodeath@gmail.com. If you're using the Spotify app, there's a Q&A function attached to the episode where you can submit any questions or topics or just say, hey. I would love to hear from you guys. And if you haven't already, please leave a 5-star review and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Until next time, remember, nothing good comes from going underground and consuming toxic fungi that your weird cousin tells you is delicious. If they tell you to eat the mushrooms, don't. Go home, make a burger, do literally anything else. They will turn you blind. And I'll lure you to death in the next one. See ya.